All-rounders who don't quite cut it get the most flack.
This is the last book. It's almost as good as a Minecraft video. Imagine that.
I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that all-rounders are incredibly talented, but they haven't quite mastered all of that talent yet. They're not quite on top of it. Quite often they can't bat or bowl at the level that we would want when they get to the international level, right? The talent is there, but the planning and the skills and the execution and the role, it's not quite there. So they get more flack than a normal player. Now, if you happen to be an all-rounder and also the son of an Australian player, who also happens to have a brother who frustrates fans just as much, it means that at a certain point, it felt like Mitch Marsh was invented to troll Australian fans. He was fun, and he hit the ball hard, and he bowled faster than most all-rounders do, but none of it clicked. No one could quite see what was going to happen with Mitchell Marsh. Even in this tournament, it was like a classic Mitchell Marsh tournament. Langer talked him up like he was his favourite son early on. That he was dropped from the team entirely when they thought they needed extra bowling. And even when they played Sri Lanka, he was demoted down the order and didn't bat at all. If Australia had a shit game later on in that tournament, the narrative right now would be that Mitch Marsh just wasn't good enough again. That's if he was even being mentioned at all, and it would only be negative. But instead, they moved him back to first drop, and they also seemed to unleash him. Australia went with him as a power play maximizer, if you will, and Marsh loves seam bowling, and everything came aligned today because New Zealand don't bowl spin in the power play, like less than anyone else. And so Marsh was the perfect player to go in, and his first 3 balls were 6, 4 and 4 from Adam Milne. Even if he knocked the ball around after that, it was already a win for Australia. And he didn't. He actually continued to attack. The slog sweep against Santner was perhaps the most important shot in this game. Because if there was any chance that New Zealand were going to get back in, it was going to be strangling through their spinners in the middle. And the guy they called Bison was having none of it. He just humped the ball away. He was absolutely perfect. Australia could not have planned this any better. And they didn't plan it. Him or anything else. I mean, Marsh became the number 3 almost entirely by accident. In fact, this team became the World Cup winners almost entirely by accident. In the last 2 years in T20 cricket, Australia has tried at number 3 Smith, Wade, Stoinis, Carey, Phillippe, and Marsh. And then when Marsh got his chance, it was in like a half-strength Australian team. There was almost no one else to fill out the 11. This was a case of talent winning out over planning. There was almost no planning. But perhaps the best representation of this is Josh Hazlewood. On the 5th of February in 2014, Hazlewood played a game for the Sydney Sixers. On the 5th of January 2020, he played a game for the Sixers again. In the almost 6 years in between, he played 3 T20s. All in 2016. One was a game against South Africa at Joburg, and then 2 World Cup matches in India. Australia took Hazlewood to a World Cup despite the fact that he hadn't played any T20 cricket. Things have changed a little bit since then. If Hazlewood is a good T20 bowler, it is almost nothing to do with Australia. They never wanted him to win. They showed no interest in him learning how to get good. In fact, at white ball cricket at all. They didn't even use him in the 2019 World Cup. After the World Cup victory today, Justin Langer just said that Hazlewood was injured during the last World Cup. Have a look what Hazlewood says about that. And so he spent his spare time going off getting good at T20 cricket. Probably the money in the IPL helped, but he also went and started playing Big Bash as well. And he has got good. He's still limited in many ways, but he's spectacular early on. And it's worth looking at that first wicket of Daryl Mitchell, which is almost like a combination of 2 of the things that Josh Hazlewood is very good at in Test cricket and T20 cricket. He hit the hard length for 3 straight balls, and Mitchell couldn't get it away. One went to point, I think, the other one went to cover. Mitchell timed them perfectly, and either could have found a gap and easily gone to the boundary. And in Test cricket, Hazlewood would have just kept bowling that line and length. And in white ball cricket, especially ODI cricket, he might have changed it. But this is the new Josh Hazlewood who has been perfecting his T20 bowling in the last 18 months. So he hit that heavy length again. The ball was almost identical to the ones before where it landed. It was just a completely different ball. It was like a cross seam ball where he rolled his fingers down the back of it. That is something that you do not see him bowl really in Test matches. And 2 years ago, I don't even think he was bowling deliveries like that, nor all the knuckleballs he's been going. And instead, he used his line and length against Mitchell with his new skill that he learned in T20 cricket, and he dismissed the man who essentially put New Zealand in the final. So if Hazlewood is at one end where he basically went off and worked this out on his own, Warner is at the other end. Warner was picked to play T20 cricket for Australia at a very young age when he hadn't even played a first-class game. But for years, Australia haven't really used Warner correctly when they've been at a World Cup. In the 2016 tournament, they turned up with David Warner and Aaron Finch. That's a lot of IPL crawls right there. But they didn't open them together. Imagine having one of the best players in the world in one spot and just like moving them around. It was odd at the time, but also it looked really bad when the best years of Warner's career happened when there was no World Cup. Warner's just been incredible for a long time now. And finally, when there is a World Cup, people are questioning whether David Warner has lost it. And he has lost something, his captaincy and his spot in the Sunrisers Hyderabad, on the back of 6 poor innings in which 2 were run-outs. It shows 2 things, I think: an amazing misunderstanding of T20 cricket and probably terrible roster design. To think that Warner was finished on the back of a few innings after he was the most dominant force in the IPL for 6 seasons is bizarre. And when he looked ropey in the first game here, people continued to say that he was finished. And yet here he is, the second leading run scorer at a ridiculous strike rate for what is a very slow scoring tournament. He's not the wild bull of his youth, and certainly not the reverend figure that many tried to force on him, partially ironically. But he has transitioned himself into this incredible, efficient, effective, and consistent scorer. And in this tournament, he was what he used to be for the Sunrisers, and what Australia had been hoping for a long time. And in Warner and Hazlewood, what you had was 2 immensely talented players being used as they should be, which is generally not the case for Australia at this particular tournament, which was one of the reasons they hadn't won it before. And it's also what they were going up against. I mean, Kane Williamson just looks at cricket differently to others. He has the ability to slow the ball down when it is bowled, but he also does it with his thinking as well. He seemed to work out exactly what was needed to score on that pitch. And even with the slow start, it didn't matter. He ended up still scoring quicker than Warner or Marsh. This was just an incredible innings of T20 batting, but unfortunately, his teammates couldn't match him at all. It was brilliant the way he took risks against Marsh and Maxwell, and he was incredible against STARC. He took on the angles against STARC. Even if there was an outside edge that did a lot of heavy lifting in the particular heavy over, it was the thinking behind it that was so brilliant. But sadly for him, he was the only one who really thought it through. And while they should have pushed 200 realistically, Guptill, Phillips and the death hitters just couldn't step up with him. And if that wasn't disappointing enough for Williamson when he batted, a similar thing happened when they bowled. Milne, Southey, Santner, these are IPL players, international players, experienced players that have got them to this final, and they could not get it right. And at the very same time they were all going for runs, or in some cases almost billions of runs, Trent Boult was unplayable. He managed to take the 2 most important wickets and not get hit off the square. Like Hazlewood, he was a test specialist who worked on his T20 game, probably because it looked like the IPL might move on from him. Tonight he took Finch, giving New Zealand their first chance of winning, and then Warner, giving them their final hope, I suppose. But the thing is that Australia just had more talent that was working for them. Even if they hadn't spent years developing it like New Zealand, or planning for these sorts of tournaments like England, or perfecting it in T20 franchises like the West Indies, Australia came into this World Cup with Warner, Finch, Maxwell, Smith, Hazlewood, Cummins and STARC. They had so much talent in this final that Smith never batted. STARC had perhaps the worst game of his career and Finch failed. In fact, on Finch, Bubba, Morgan, Williamson, Kohli, Pollard, they've all been like front and centre at times for good and bad reasons as captains of their teams. Finch has been like the guy that you invite to the party and comes all the way over but like stands on your front steps and never comes into the house. And yet they still won easy with this invisible captain. And also they won easy with their team construction being a smoking hot mess for a long time. Their batting promotion and demotions in this World Cup made almost no sense at times. They were lucky that STOINIS went off to the IPL to get good at batting in the middle order. But at the same time, his bowling slipped so much that they were unlucky that they didn't actually get an over out of him in either of the finals. Not to mention that Matthew Wade was dropped in at number 7, not as a cunning ploy, but because they had to put him somewhere. He's never been good at number 7. He's never really been good at T20 when not opening. Yet it was he and the Delhi Capitals middle order STOINIS who got them to this final. People will point to the fact that they won the toss 6 times in this tournament, and the only time they lost it, England beat them. But if you want real luck and chance of how Australia has ended up winning this tournament, they were 5 wickets down in the 13th over of the semi-final, with only bowlers who could hit to come. And they were saved by one guy who taught himself because he kind of had to, and another guy who just played the best middle overs knock of his life If you want more signs of the sort of randomness of Australia, remember that the game that they lost, they abandoned two things. Their ability to bat Wade at number 7, so they could fit in an extra bowler in the side, and Mitch Marsh batting at number 3. The way they lost to England was the way they won the finals. And the good fortune goes further than that, of course. They got to play New Zealand, who are making a very good claim to be the best all-format team in the entire world, and still not the best team in any format on either side of the Tasman when they're playing Australia. I mean, England smoked Australia viciously. I don't know if you can viciously smoke someone, but they did in the early part of this tournament. And England looked like the best team all tournament until New Zealand beat them in the semi-finals. And if England didn't look like the best team in the tournament, then Pakistan did. And Australia completely outthought Pakistan, who of all teams looked incredibly rigid and unable to change. But even then, Pakistan really only needed one more wicket to end that game and go into the final. I mean, Australia had to gamble in every single game they played. They either picked 5 bowlers, in which they had Ashton Agar as their number 7, which looked hilarious when they played England, or they picked the extra bat and hoped that they could combine 4 overs between Marsh, STOINIS and Maxwell. In the semi-final, that worked incredibly well. In the final, those 4 overs went for 39 runs, which is actually a lot. But if your frontlining bowlers make up for it, it's not a problem at all. But Mitchell Starc went for 60 runs. I mean, Starc has, unsurprisingly, never gone for this many runs in a T20 match before. Not even, close to this, really. In fact, this is 10 runs worse than his previous worst game. Even in matches where he had not finished because he'd been bowling poorly, he'd never even been close to an economy rate this bad. This was, undoubtedly, the worst game that Mitchell Starc has ever bowled in a T20, and he happened to do it in the World Cup final. And this is the man who won them the 2015 World Cup and kept them in the 2019 tournament. And he was dire. Between him and the 5th bowler overs, they went for 99 runs. It's extraordinary to think that they made up 40% of the overs and 60% of the runs. But Australia didn't get away because of the talent that was in the other 3 bowlers. I've already covered Hazlewood, but it's worth having a quick shout out to Pat Cummins. His figures won't look quite as good as Hazlewood's, but that's because he bowled almost all of his overs when New Zealand were already flying at the death. But on 2 occasions, it's grounded them, I suppose. It looked like New Zealand might score around 15 runs and over for a long time and end up with somewhere around 200. But it was really Cummins who kept pulling them back. But it's also worth shouting out Adam Zampa. He was the only frontline spinner in this team pretty much all tournament long. Maxwell did very well in some games and struggled in some others, and Agar played only 1 match. But Zampa had to be Australia's spinner all the way through. And being a leg spinner in Australia really hasn't been easy since 1992, unless your name is Shane Warne. Adam Zampa has come in and out of fashion when it comes to the Australian team. He's not the kind of leg spinner that Aussies naturally like. He doesn't turn it much. He's a nagging leg spinner. But what Zampa has done is, whether he's been in fashion or out of fashion, is just work on his game consistently. Didn't matter if Australia wanted him. He is never going to be Rashid Khan, but he's so incredibly smart. And in a tournament where spoiler bowlers are at their best, Zampa just bowled at the stumps and made teams hit him. He was incredibly accurate. And he was humble enough after the game to actually say, well, he was lucky that Australia bowled first most of the time and it was a little bit dry. But all tournament long, he never gave the batters anything. It wasn't tough being Zampa in this tournament. It was tough playing Zampa in this tournament. And Zampa was a fairly unlikely hero in this tournament. David Warner got player of the tournament, but Zampa was probably maybe 2nd or 3rd best player in this tournament. And when we're talking about unlikely heroes, obviously Mitchell Marsh has got to be right up there. Let's go back a game when, for some reason, with Steve Smith in their side, when Australia sent Marsh in to face Shaheen Afridi at full roar. Marsh hit a beautiful 4, but also played and missed balls that he wasn't even casually acquainted with. At that stage, you would have to say that he did not look like an international number 3. And I want you to think back to the history of Cricket World Cups, and finals specifically. Think of the players that have batted at number 3 for their nation in World Cup finals, whether it be ODI or T20. Ricky Ponting has done it 4 times. Viv Richards has done it. Kane Williamson and Kumar Sangakkara have done it a bunch of times across formats. Number 3 is where you drop your star traditionally. And the 2 World Cups have proved that again and again. Of course, there's always been some beautiful randomness from Pakistan, who used a pinch hitter, Shaheen Afridi, and a pinch blocker in Imran Khan. But when you look at the names on this list, you'll see this is some of the greatest batters that we've ever had, and some really high-end quality batting talent at time. And if you were judging just purely on natural batting talent, Mitch Marsh is not going to be high on this list. In fact, until now, he's been largely irrelevant as an international batter. And even a week or 2 ago, he was dropped midway through this tournament, and the other game where Australia didn't even use him. and he's been a fan's punching bag for most of his career. And Mitch Marsh just batted so well at number 3 in a World Cup final that Australia won it. Mitch Marsh was unplanned talent that came together at the right time. He was the perfect unlikely hero of Australia's unlikely win.